Hello, all. Today I'm going to be talking to you about persuasive speaking, and this is our next upcoming speech. So far, we've talked about informative speaking, both with the cultural artifact speech as well as with our true informative speech. So to start off, I think we need to define it and make sure that we understand what persuasive speaking is. I bet a lot of us have done some sort of persuasive work, whether it's writing or maybe you've done a speech yourself. But let's begin with what the definition is. So a persuasive speech is a speech that attempts to change or reinforce the audience's thoughts, feelings, or actions through its message. So here we're already seeing a difference from informative speaking, where in informative speaking, our general purpose is to inform, and that's it. We are just trying to impart knowledge and information to our audience, and there's no real expectation of what our audience does with that knowledge or information. But here, with persuasive speaking, there is some expectations on the audience. We're trying to change them, or we're trying to reinforce something. And what we're trying to change or reinforce is their thoughts, feelings, or actions, behaviors. And so we do so by advocating for a specific issue, belief, or course of action. So we're going to talk about the three different types of persuasive speeches. The first one is what we call a question of fact. And this is trying to convince our audience that something is true or isn't true, that something is a fact or not a fact. So over on the right, I have some examples. This company has a glass ceiling for women, or this company doesn't. Ali's death was a case of physician-assisted suicide, or it was not. Marijuana is a gateway drug. Marijuana is not. Television violence leads to violent behavior, or it does not. So here, all of these, we're trying to convince our audience of whether something is true or not. We're trying to get them to agree on our sense of reality. So a question of fact. The next one we have is a question of value. So here, we're not trying to convince them that something is true or isn't true, that something is real or isn't real. Instead, we're trying to convince them what value to ascribe to it, or in other words, what they should feel about something. So here you're advocating for the merit, morality, or value of an issue. So let's take the first example over on the right. The death penalty is unjustifiable. Here, you're not trying to convince your audience that the death penalty exists. Instead, you're trying to convince them what to feel about it, that it is not worth it, that it is unjustifiable. Other examples include bullfighting is inhumane, chemical weapons are immoral, human cloning is morally justified, abortion is wrong, sexual and racial discrimination in the workplace is wrong, and college athletics minimize the importance of academics. So here, trying to convince them what is true, or excuse me, not what is true, but what to feel about it, right? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it beautiful? Is it ugly? How should they feel? And then the last one is what we call a question of policy. And I think when we hear the word policy, we automatically think of legislation or politics. And while that definitely can be included under the term policy, more broadly, we're thinking of policy as action or behavior. So question of fact, is something true or not true? Question of value, how should I feel about it? Question of policy, what should I do about it? So it's the best course of action. So again, let's take the first example on the right. Our community should adopt a zero tolerance policy for guns in schools. So here, we're not trying to convince them of a question of fact. That would be, are guns in schools, right? That would be a question of fact speech. We're also not trying to convince them how they should feel about it. With this one, the assumption is that everyone feels that it's not good, right? Gun violence in schools is not good. So instead, you're advocating for what is the best course of action. What should we do? Therefore, our community should adopt a zero tolerance policy for guns in schools. Question of policy. Some other examples include abortion should be available on demand, music CDs should be rated for violence and profanity, divorce should be granted by mutual consent, marijuana should be legalized, smoking should be banned from all public buildings and parks. So all of these are what we should do or what we shouldn't do. What is the best course of action? Oftentimes you're offering a solution for a problem. So to review, these are the three types of persuasive speeches: question of fact, value, and policy. A really simple way of thinking about it is, what are you trying to convince your audience? What to think, what to feel, or what to do? So now that we've talked about the different types of persuasive speech, let's go over the different organizational patterns. I think I previewed this in class earlier this semester, but with organizational patterns and informative speeches, we only talked about 4 different kinds. We talked about chronological, spatial, topical, and causal, and we pretty much stuck to those 4 organizational patterns. But with persuasive speaking, we have a lot more options that we can do. We have a lot more organizational styles to choose from. And typically, it's going to depend on what type of persuasive speech we have. So questions of fact and value, because they're not so much focused on what you should do, you're probably going to do chronological, spatial, or topical patterns for that. And these are all ones that we've heard of before. Chronological is organizing by time, spatial organizing by space, and topical organizing by topics. So where I want to spend our time is really talking about the organizational patterns for the different questions of policy. So here we have, and I'm going to talk about the first 2 at the same time because they're essentially the same: problem, solution. So here we're going to probably have 2 main points, and this is okay. Remember, we're going to aim for 3, but sometimes we can get away with 2 main points or 4 main points. And this is a time where we can get away with 2 main points. So our first main point would be establishing the problem. So if we're using the example of gun violence in schools and educational settings, we would want to maybe talk about some statistics on previous gun violence. We maybe want to talk about solutions that have happened that haven't worked or that we thought would work and then didn't end up working. Any of that. You want to establish the problem. Then in your main point 2, that is what you're advocating for, is what is your specific solution to that problem? And maybe it is to adopt a zero tolerance policy for guns in schools. So that could work. The next organizational pattern we have is problem, cause, solution. And this is helpful when your problem isn't as well known and you need to include a little bit more context for your audience to understand what the problem is. So let's say that you are talking about fast fashion. I bet some of you have maybe heard that term before, but maybe not all of us. So if that is the problem, I need to know, and I should know, my audience probably isn't going to know a ton about this going into my speech. So let me provide some context. So with fast fashion, when you're talking about the problem, you maybe want to talk about how we turn over clothes too often, right? We buy cheap clothes that are poorly made and they go bad quickly, or they shrink in the wash, whatever it may be, and we just end up spending a little bit more money, right? Maybe not terrible, but in the long run, maybe not financially a good idea for individuals. But fast fashion has problems that are deeper than that. If you go into the cause, here's where you'd really want to talk about the different large-scale economic factors and also labor factors that go into fast fashion. And some stores that are considered fast fashion would be Forever 21, H&M, Old Navy, the online store ASOS. So those are stores that are going to be producing a lot of clothing that is cheaply made, that is cheaply sold, but is low quality. And in order to do that, they have some pretty poor factory conditions to do that. Also, it's just bad for the environment to be making this excess of clothes. So it's bad for the individual financially, it's bad for the environment, it's bad for workers working in these factories creating these clothing. pieces. So it's a problem, right? And you maybe didn't know that. So that's why you need to include the cause. But then you also need to include what is your solution. And maybe your solution is including a capsule wardrobe, which is where you have maybe 15 to 20 pieces of clothing, ranging all different types of clothing from pants, jeans, shirts, jackets, whatever it may be. And you get them ethically made, or from stores that make clothes ethically, and by doing so you just recycle your clothing, right? You're just wearing the same outfits kind of over and over again. You're mixing and matching, but the key is that you're buying good quality pieces that are going to hold up over a long amount of time, so that way you're not buying clothes from H&M every season. You have a set of clothes at home that are well made, that are going to last, and you are not participating in that cycle of fast fashion. So kind of a lengthy example, but you can see problem cause solution is helpful if your audience doesn't know the problem, and you need to include a little bit about the cause. So let's move on to the next organizational pattern. This is causal, and we've already talked about this. This is talking about cause and effect. So I'm going to move on and talk about narrative. And narrative is a really interesting organizational pattern, but it's difficult to do because it requires you to have a story, and that is how you organize your speech. So for this, what you're going to do is take a story, and the different narrative plot points are going to be where you branch off and include more information. So if you are having a persuasive speech about breast cancer, for example, so maybe you want to talk about the story of your aunt and how she was diagnosed with breast cancer, but you want to start off with her diagnosis. So you tell a little bit of her story up to that point, and then you branch off and you give statistics about how many people are diagnosed with breast cancer, what are the types of people, what are the different demographics. Then you return to her story and you talk about how she started to do chemotherapy, and then you branch off and you give information about the different treatments and chemotherapy in treating cancer. Then you return to her story and you talk about how she's now in remission and she's an activist. And then maybe you want to branch off and talk about what are the things that you can do to increase awareness, to increase the health awareness of people around you. So you're using a story as how you organize your information. It requires you to have a really strong story, but also one that you can tell in bits and pieces, and your audience will still be able to follow. The second to last one we have is called comparative advantage. And comparative advantage is almost the opposite of problem cause solution. So instead of your audience not really knowing a lot about your problem, they already know a lot about your problem, and they know the cause. And what the real disagreement is how to solve it, is what the solution is. So for this organizational pattern, you are taking your main points, and each main point is going to be a different solution to the problem, and you end with your solution, comparing it to the other ones to say that yours is the best solution out there. So comparative advantage, all of your main points are the different solutions, and yours is the best, and you present it as the best. And then the last organizational pattern we have is Monroe's motivated sequence. And this one is a little bit more involved than the other ones. So let's break it down into its sections. So this Monroe's motivated sequence pattern has 5 different components. It has attention, need, satisfaction, visualization, and action. So it may seem like you might have 5 main points. That's not true. So let's go through them. The first one, attention. This is in your introduction. So here you are bringing attention to the issue, to the topic at hand. You're not talking about what the issues are with it, but instead you're just letting your audience know what conversation are you entering into. Are you talking about fast fashion? Are you talking about health? Are you talking about the environment or climate change? Then you go into your first main point, which is need, and that is where you establish the problem. So you talk about what is the issue at hand that needs to be solved. Then main point 2 is the satisfaction, and that is your solution. So up until this point, this is problem solution. You have a clearly defined problem and you have a clearly defined solution. Main point 3 is really what makes Monroe's motivated sequence different. Main point 3 is visualization. And here you're going to ask your audience and you're going to do the work for them using your words. You are going to have them visualize the future with your solution in place and how great that world would be. So you're going to talk about the benefits of your solution. You're asking your audience to visualize the future. How great is it going to be with your solution? Or you can do the other side of that. You can ask your audience to visualize the future and how terrible things are going to be without your solution in place. Either way, you're forward casting, you're future casting, and you're talking about the benefits of your solution or the negatives if your solution is not in place, or both. Then lastly, you jump to your conclusion, and that is where you have your call to action, where you answer the question, now what? Now what should your audience do? And so this is where you're going to have your audience do something, right? And you're going to tell them what you think that they as individuals can do to help address this problem that you just laid out. So there's 5 components: attention, need, satisfaction, visualization, and action, but still only 3 main points: problem, solution, benefits. So that is all of the different organizational patterns that we have. I quickly want to talk a little bit about evidence, emotions, and ethics. So this is referring more to the content, the information that we're going to be placing in our speeches. So with persuasive speaking, we really need to be mindful of the evidence that we are using. So in informative speeches, we probably just called this supporting details, but now we essentially have a claim that we are trying to advocate for, right? And that is our topic and our position. We call that our claim. So we need to provide evidence to support our claim. And so this is our supporting details. These are our outside sources. But with all of this type of information, we want to make sure that we're doing the following things: that we're first using specific evidence and we're not using vague or general evidence. The more specific and narrowed in that you can get your evidence, the better, because it's going to be easier for your audience to see the connection between your evidence and your claim. Next, you want to use novel information. So use interesting information they maybe haven't heard before or haven't thought about in that way. And then lastly, we want to make sure that we're using credible sources. We are going to have a scholarly source requirement for this speech as well, but even for our non-scholarly sources, we want to make sure that we're using credible sources, that we're not using fake news, but that we're using established and credible sources for our evidence. And so with that, I think we really need to think about credibility beyond just our sources, but with persuasive speaking, we have to be exceptionally mindful of our own credibility. And we have a credibility sentence in our introduction, which we will continue to do. But I think it's helpful to think about the different types of credibility and what credibility is in general. So credibility is the culmination of competence and character. It's the trust that your audience can place in you based on your competence. Do you know what you're talking about? And your character. Do I trust you to take care of me, or to be honest with me, or to not mislead me? So we have 3 different types of credibility. The first is initial credibility, and this is what your audience thinks of you before you even speak. When they hear that you are coming up to the podium or that you're walking up to the classroom, maybe they have seen you speak before and that has informed their initial credibility. Maybe it's based on your name or what you look like or where you work, what your job title is, whatever it may be. What do they think of you before your speech? Next, we have derived credibility, and this is the credibility that you accrue throughout the course of your speech. So as you're speaking, maybe they thought, I've seen her speak before and I haven't been too impressed, so I don't have high expectations. But as you're speaking, you're on your A game, and your audience may think, oh, maybe I undervalued them, I underestimated them. They actually know what they're talking about, and they seem to really care about what they're talking about, and they're using credible sources. So derived credibility, again, is the credibility that you gain throughout the momentum of your speech. And then lastly is terminal credibility. So now that your speech is over, what do they think of your competence and your character? Terminal credibility. So how to establish credibility? So we talked about the importance of it, the different kinds of it, but what do we actually do in order to establish, maintain, and grow credibility? So we can start by explaining our competence as we begin our speech, and we already do that. That is why we have our credibility statement in our introduction. So we are very clear right off the bat in explaining why our audience can trust us as we talk about what our speech is about. Another way to establish credibility is to establish common ground with your audience. This can really help with the character component of credibility. Next, delivery is so important. Delivery is always important, but it feels exceptionally important with persuasive speaking. So we can deliver our speech fluently with expression and conviction. If we seem like we are passionate about our speech, then our audience is going to join us, right? That can be a communal experience that you can have with your audience, and being interested and excited, or maybe outraged at your speech, right? Whatever the appropriate emotion and tone is, express that with your voice, with your body, with your hand gestures, with all of that. And then lastly, a way to establish the competence component of credibility is to address the counter argument. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the counter argument later on, like right now. So with the counter argument, what it is an argument or set of reasons put forward to oppose an idea or theory developed in another argument. Kind of a lengthy and wordy definition, but you probably have heard of this before. This is just, what is the other side of the debate? If you are advocating for one solution, what are the other solutions? If you think something is true, what do other people think is true that's different from what you think? So we do need to include the counter argument somewhere in our speech. Unlike the credibility statement that goes in a particular place, that goes in our introduction, the counter argument can be anywhere. It can be in one of your main points. It can be in your conclusion. It can be an entire main point on its own, or it can just be part of something smaller. Either way, you have to have it. You have to say, what is the other side of the argument? And by doing so, we increase our credibility by having a minor component of comparative advantage, of saying, I am so knowledgeable about this topic. I know what all of the other opinions are. I know what all the other solutions are, and I still choose my solution. And it can also help you avoid judgmental or inflammatory counter arguments. So we have to be careful when we address the counter argument, when we talk about it in our speeches, and we're not trying to villainize the other side, because that can come off as maybe too aggressive or too assertive, or just unkind, and that can damage the character component of your credibility. So we need to talk about the other side. We don't need to be rude about it, essentially. So the last thing that I want to talk about with you all is the Aristotle's artistic proofs. You probably have heard of this before: ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos refers to credibility, which we've talked about earlier. Logos refers to data and logic, but today I really want to focus on pathos, which is the use of emotions. So speakers persuade primarily when they appeal to emotions, because they encourage the audience to relate to an issue on an internal, personal level. So using Pathos and emotional appeals is really, really effective in our persuasive speeches, but we need to be really mindful in how we do that, because an inappropriate appeal to emotions can cause an audience to shut down in an instant. So there's a lot of power when it comes to emotions, so we have to tread carefully and tread lightly. And I think it's also helpful to be mindful of what are the primary emotions that we are appealing to. So we have fear, anger, surprise, sadness, disgust, or happiness. So when we're appealing to emotions, we need to know, what emotion are we appealing to? What emotion are we trying to stir up in our audience? Is it fear or is it happiness? Because that's going to look very different. And then it can also be helpful to appeal to secondary emotions, and those are pride, guilt, shame, or reverence. So when appealing to emotions, there's a couple things that we can do, and also they serve a couple different purposes for us in our speech. They can help gain the attention of our audience. So we can use an appeal to emotions in our attention getter right at the beginning of the speech. And doing so may help motivate our audience to listen better. Remembering that our goal is to have a listenable speech. So this can help that happen. We also can express our personal commitment by appealing to emotions, and that goes back into establishing a common ground with our audience. And then lastly, it can be our call to action, a memorable closer. By appealing to emotions in our call to action, there's a greater chance that our audience will do that. They may feel more compelled to follow through on your call to action if they're emotionally invested. But just as there's things to do and good purposes that emotions can serve, it can also have a downside. So with the ethics of emotions, these are the things we want to avoid. We want to avoid overly graphic visuals. We don't necessarily want to traumatize our audience or trigger them. That is not what we want to do. And this is where we can go past the point of effective persuasion and into shutting down our audience. We also don't want to threaten our audience. We don't want to have threatening appeals. If we have to threaten our audience, that usually means that we aren't smart enough to craft arguments that are based on logic and emotion. And we have to resort to threatening them. We also don't want to manipulate our audience in any way. But what can we do? So we do want to include vivid language. Our language use is really going to be important in how we achieve an appeal of emotions. So we want to be really intentional with our word choice, knowing that words have connotative meanings, and know, what does this word invoke, what type of feeling, what tone, and then have that match what you want your audience to feel in that moment. We also ultimately want to balance emotion and reason. We want to balance pathos and logos. We want to not just have all emotional appeals, and also not just have all logical appeals. We talked a little bit about this when we were talking about supporting materials. So using narratives, definitions, testimonies, statistics, all of that. We don't want to just use all testimonies. We also don't want to just all use statistics. We want a well-balanced speech that appeals to everyone in our audience and doesn't rely too heavily on one or the other. So with that, I'm going to conclude our mini lecture on persuasive speaking. Thank you for listening, and remember to continue the rest of the module. Thanks, y'all.